Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something a little different. We're going to slow down, way down. We're going to walk together through a world that most of us have never known. A world where the arrival of cold air wasn't just an inconvenience, where it didn't just mean pulling a sweater from the back of your closet or turning up the thermostat by 2 degrees. Tonight, we are stepping onto a 19th century American farm, sometime in the 1800s on the very first morning that the ground feels different underfoot. A little harder, a little less forgiving. The kind of morning where your breath hangs in the air just long enough for you to notice it, and then disappears. And you notice something else too, a stillness. Not the pleasant kind of stillness you feel on a lazy Sunday. This is the stillness of a world beginning to lock itself down. The birds are quieter. The insects are gone. The creek at the edge of the property moves a little slower than it did last week. And the mud that has been sucking at your boots since September is starting, just barely, to firm up. Winter is not here yet, but it has sent word ahead. You are a farmer, and that word changes everything. In the 1800s, roughly 80% of the American population lived and worked on farms. This was not a lifestyle choice in the way we sometimes romanticize it today. No farmhouse aesthetic, no artisan cheese-making hobby, no Instagram-worthy sunrise over the fields. This was survival work, the kind of work that required your full attention, your full body, and nearly every hour of daylight you were given. And in winter, the stakes of that work didn't drop. If anything, they quietly, steadily rose. Your farm, depending on where you live, might sit somewhere in rural Ohio, or Pennsylvania, or maybe the wind-swept plains of Illinois, where the horizon goes on so long it starts to feel personal. The house behind you is modest, timber-framed, chinked with whatever material was available, drafty in ways that no amount of creative furniture arrangement can fully solve. There's a barn. There are animals in that barn. There's a root cellar dug into the hillside nearby. And right now is your most important piece of real estate. More important than the house, some years. You do not own a thermometer. Many families did not, especially in the early decades of the century. You know it is cold because your body tells you so, and because the water in the bucket near the door has a thin skin of ice on it by morning. That is your thermometer, that thin skin of ice. Now, before we go any further, and we're going to go quite far tonight through frozen fields and smoky kitchens and long, quiet evenings by firelight, I want to pause for just a moment. If you find these slow, sleepy journeys into history comforting, you can like and subscribe, but only if it feels right. No pressure, no urgency. We are leaving urgency at the door tonight, along with the cold. And if you feel like dropping a comment before you drift off, I would genuinely love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that someone in an apartment in Sao Paulo and someone in a farmhouse in Vermont are both settling in for the same slow story. Now then, back to your farm. The landscape around you is not yet white. That comes later. Right now, it is the color of November, all tawny browns and faded yellows. The last of the corn stalks standing in ragged rows, the oak trees holding onto a few last stubborn leaves as if they haven't quite accepted the situation. The sky is the particular shade of gray that means business. Not a storm, not today. Just that permanent overcast that settles over the American Midwest and Northeast in late autumn and doesn't really lift again until April, sometimes May, occasionally never. Or at least that's how it feels by February. Your day started before sunrise. It always does. You were out of bed while the house was still dark. Not because you were unusually motivated, but because the animals needed feeding and the fire needed stoking, and neither of those things would wait for you to feel ready. There's a particular kind of tiredness that farm families of the 1800s carried through winter. Not the sharp exhaustion of a bad night's sleep, but a deep, accumulated weariness that settled into the bones sometime around late October and didn't fully leave until the spring thaw. You carried it the way you carried everything else, quietly and without much comment. Historians still argue about the precise rhythms of rural American farm life in this period. How much leisure time families truly had, how much the experience varied between regions, between wealthy landowners and tenant farmers, between families with many children to share the labor, and those facing a hard winter with only two pairs of hands. What they agree on is this: winter was never truly a rest. It was a different kind of work in a different kind of cold, with different things at stake. But it was also, in its own strange way, beautiful. There is a reason so many memoirs and letters from this era describe winter evenings with a kind of warmth that has nothing to do with temperature. The fire. The family gathered close. The sound of wind against the shutters that somehow makes the inside feel safer. The particular satisfaction of knowing that the cellar is full, the wood is stacked, and for tonight at least, you have done enough. That feeling, that quiet, hard-won enough, is what we're going to follow tonight. So get comfortable. Adjust your pillow. Pull the blanket a little higher if you need to. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You did not have a weather app. Let that settle for a moment. No notification popping up on a screen to tell you that a cold front was moving in from the northwest. No color-coded radar map. No cheerful meteorologist standing in front of a green screen with a confident prediction that would turn out to be wrong anyway. You had something older than all of that. You had the world itself, and you had learned, over years and generations, how to read it. In the 1800s, American farmers were extraordinary observers. They had to be. Their ability to predict, or at least to make educated guesses about what the coming winter might bring, could mean the difference between a cellar stocked with enough food to last until April and a family rationing the last of the turnips by February. So they watched. They watched everything, and they watched it carefully. They watched the woolly bear caterpillar. If you have never encountered this particular creature, it is a small, fuzzy caterpillar banded in black and rusty brown, and according to folk tradition stretching back well into the 18th century, the width of its brown middle band could predict the severity of the coming winter. A wide brown band meant a mild winter. A narrow brown band, mostly black, meant you were in for it. Farmers took this seriously. Some of them took it very seriously. Modern entomologists have largely concluded that the caterpillar's coloring has more to do with its age and the moisture conditions of its particular environment than with any meteorological gift. But in the 1800s, that caterpillar was a tiny, crawling forecast, and people watched where it was going and how fast. The caterpillar was not alone in its predictive duties. Farmers watched the behavior of squirrels. A squirrel gathering nuts with unusual urgency, moving faster than normal, cheeks stuffed to comic proportions, was considered a sign that the animal knew something you didn't. Squirrels, it was believed, could feel the winter coming in their bones before any human instrument could detect it. Whether this is entirely true in the way farmers understood, it is still a matter of gentle debate among naturalists. But there is something real underneath the folklore. Animals do respond to environmental cues, shifts in temperature, barometric pressure, the quality of light, in ways that are subtle enough to escape casual human notice. The farmers weren't wrong to watch. They were simply working with the best tools available to them. They watched the thickness of onion skins. A thick-skinned onion, pulled from the garden in early autumn, was said to foretell a hard winter. The plant, apparently, was preparing its own insulation. A thin-skinned onion suggested a gentler season ahead. Whether you believe in the onion as prophet or not, the habit of observation it represents is worth pausing over. These farmers were not superstitious in a careless way. They were pattern seekers in a world that rewarded pattern recognition with survival. Historians still argue about how much of this folk forecasting was genuinely predictive and how much was retrospective, meaning people remember the winters that matched the signs and forgot the ones that didn't. This is a very human habit, and the 19th century farmer was as human as anyone. But the sheer volume and consistency of these observational traditions across different regions and different farming communities suggests that at least some of them were grounded in real ecological observation, passed down and refined over generations until they became part of the rhythm of the year. There were also the signs that had nothing to do with animals. Farmers watched the leaves. A tree holding onto its leaves later than usual into autumn was sometimes read as a warning. The tree, like the squirrel, preparing for a longer cold season. They watched the morning fog. They watched which direction the geese were flying and how high they were flying when they went. High-flying geese, it was said, meant fair weather ahead. Low geese meant storms were coming. They watched the color of the sunset. A particularly vivid red evening sky in October might be beautiful, but it was also being evaluated for what it meant about tomorrow. And then there were the almanacs. The Old Farmer's Almanac, which had been publishing since 1792, was one of the most widely read publications in rural America throughout the 1800s. Farmers trusted it the way later generations would trust the evening news, with a similar mixture of genuine faith and mild skepticism. The almanac made its winter predictions using a combination of astronomical calculations, solar cycles, and a formula that its editors kept, and still keep, famously secret. Whether it was more accurate than chance is a question that statisticians have been cheerfully arguing about for over a century. What matters is that farmers consulted it, debated it, and planned around it. It was a conversation starter, a planning tool, and a comfort all at once. Because that is what all of this watching and reading and predicting was really about, underneath the folklore and the caterpillars and the onion skins. It was about control, or rather, it was about the human need to feel some small measure of control in the face of something enormous and indifferent. Winter on a 19th century American farm was not something you can negotiate with. It came when it came, and it lasted as long as it lasted, and it killed what it killed and spared what it spared, and no amount of preparation could change those fundamental facts. But preparation could improve your odds. And the act of watching, of paying close attention to the world around you, of taking the woolly bear caterpillar seriously, even if you privately weren't sure about it, that act kept you engaged, kept you thoughtful, kept you from the particular paralysis that comes from feeling entirely at the mercy of forces beyond your understanding. So you watched the sky, you checked the almanac, you noted the squirrels, and then you got to work. Because whether winter was going to be mild or murderous, whether the brown band was wide or narrow, whether the geese were flying high or skimming low over the fields, the work was the same. The cellar needed filling. The wood needed stacking. The animals needed tending. Prediction was useful. Preparation was everything. The fields were waiting. The frost does not announce itself politely. It does not send a letter ahead. It does not knock. One evening the air has that particular sharp edge to it, the kind that makes you pull your collar up without quite deciding to, and by morning the world has changed. The puddles near the barn door are sealed over with a thin, milky crust of ice. The mud that was soft yesterday is rigid today, holding the shape of your last footprint like a plaster cast. The pumpkin vines have gone dark and limp overnight, and somewhere in the back of your chest, something tightens. Because you know what this means. The clock, which has been ticking quietly since August, has just gotten very loud. In the 1800s, the autumn harvest was not a single event. It was a sequence, a long, overlapping series of tasks that began in late summer with the grain crops and moved through weeks of gathering, threshing, drying, sorting, and storing, each crop with its own timing, its own demands, its own particular way of punishing you if you got it wrong. Wheat and rye came first in late summer, then corn, then the root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, carrots, beets, which could actually tolerate a light frost and were sometimes left in the ground deliberately until after the first cold snap, because the chill converted some of their starches to sugar and improved their flavor. This was not laziness. This was strategy. But there was a line, a point past which leaving things in the ground stopped being strategy and started being loss. When the hard frost came, not the first gentle warning frost, but the real one, the one that went deep, anything still in the soil was at serious risk. A root vegetable frozen solid in the ground, and then thawed could turn to mush. A potato left too long became a soft, disappointing thing that would rot in storage rather than last through winter. Timing mattered enormously, and the margin for error was narrow enough to be uncomfortable. So when the signs pointed to a hard frost coming, when the almanac warned of it, when the woolly bear had been looking ominous, when the evening air had that specific bite, the farm mobilized. Every available person worked. This is one of those facts about 19th century farm life that is easy to read and strangely difficult to fully absorb. When we say every available person, we mean it without exception. Children who were old enough to carry a basket were carrying baskets. Elderly grandparents who could no longer do heavy field work were sorting and packing in the barn or the cellar. Neighbors came to help, understanding implicitly that when their own harvest crunch arrived, the favor would be returned. This informal web of mutual labor was one of the foundational social structures of rural American life in this period, and it functioned with a kind of quiet efficiency that no one had to organize or announce. You simply showed up because that was what you did. The corn harvest, in particular, was a communal affair in many parts of the country. Corn husking, the process of stripping the dried outer leaves from each ear, was labor-intensive enough that it became the occasion for what were called husking bees. Neighbors gathered, often in the evening, in someone's barn, and they husked corn together for hours by lantern light. There was food, there was conversation, there was, by most accounts, quite a lot of cider. And there was a tradition, varying by region but widespread, that whoever found a red ear of corn in the pile was entitled to kiss anyone of their choosing. Historians have noted this particular custom with the kind of academic restraint that barely conceals their delight. It turns out that even in the middle of exhausting agricultural labor, human beings will find a way to make things interesting. But underneath the social warmth of the husking bee, the urgency was real. Corn that was not properly dried before storage would mold. Mold in the corn bin was not merely a setback. It was a potential catastrophe because moldy corn could not be fed to animals without risking their health, and animals that went hungry or sick in winter were animals that might not survive to work the fields in spring. The chain of consequences on a 19th century farm was short and unforgiving. One mistake compounded into the next. Potatoes required particular care. They needed to be dug before the deep frost, inspected individually for rot or damage, and stored in conditions that were cold enough to prevent sprouting, but not so cold that they froze. The root cellar had to be at just the right temperature, a narrow window that farmers managed through a combination of structural design, ventilation, and careful monitoring. A cellar that got too warm would cause the potatoes to sprout too early. A cellar that froze would ruin everything. Farmers became, out of necessity, remarkably precise managers of a system with almost no instruments and no margin for significant error. Cabbage was another winter staple that required careful handling. Many families made sauerkraut, fermented cabbage, in large quantities in the fall, packing it into barrels with salt and allowing it to ferment over weeks. This was not a culinary preference so much as a preservation strategy. Fermentation extended the life of the cabbage dramatically, and, as a bonus that no one in the 1800s fully understood, but everyone instinctively recognized, it preserved the vitamin C that would otherwise be nearly absent from the winter diet. Historians still debate the extent to which rural American farmers consciously understood the nutritional role of fermented foods, but the evidence suggests the practice was widespread enough to have made a genuine difference in winter health outcomes. The barn filled slowly, bin by bin, barrel by barrel. The cellar filled slowly, shelf by shelf, crock by crook. And every evening, you counted what you had and tried to calculate whether it was enough, knowing that the winter ahead was an unknown length, an unknown severity, and that you were essentially packing for a journey with no itinerary. But the worst of the work was still to come. Before you ate breakfast, the animals ate breakfast. This was not a rule anyone wrote down. It did not appear in any farming manual or household guide. It was simply understood the way certain things on a farm are understood, absorbed through years of watching your father do it, and his father before him, and the quiet logic of it made itself plain soon enough. An animal that went without feed became weak. A weak animal became sick. A sick animal in winter, in a barn that was already doing its best against the cold, was an animal you might lose. And losing an animal in the 1800s was not merely sad. It was a financial blow, a logistical crisis, and depending on the animal, potentially a threat to the farm's ability to function at all come spring. So you got up. You dressed in the dark. You went to the barn. The barn in winter was its own world. Step inside on a cold January morning, and the smell hit you first. The thick, warm smell of hay and manure and animal bodies. Not unpleasant exactly, or at least not to someone who had grown up with it, but undeniably present. After the sharp cold of the walk from the house, the barn's interior temperature was almost shocking. Animals generate heat. A barn full of cattle, horses, pigs, and chickens was significantly warmer than the air outside, sometimes by 20 degrees or more, and farmers understood this well enough to design their barns with it in mind. The animals were not merely inhabitants of the barn. They were, in a very practical sense, its heating system. Cattle were the most demanding of the winter animals, and in many cases the most valuable. A dairy cow needed to be fed, watered, and milked twice a day without exception. Not approximately twice a day. Not most days. Every day, at roughly consistent times, because a dairy cow's production was sensitive to disruption in ways that farmers knew from experience, even if they couldn't have explained the underlying biology. Skipping a milking, or significantly delaying one, was the kind of decision you made only in genuine emergency, and even then you felt its consequences in reduced production for days afterward. The feed for cattle in winter was primarily hay, dried grass cut and stored in the barn loft during summer and autumn, the quantity of which was one of the central calculations of the farming year. How much hay did you have? How many animals did you have? How long was the winter likely to last? These three numbers were in constant conversation with each other all winter long, and farmers monitored the hay supply the way a modern person might monitor a bank account during a difficult month. Carefully, sometimes anxiously, always with an eye on the ratio between what remained and how far away spring seemed. Running out of hay before spring arrived was one of the signature disasters of 19th century farm winters. When it happened, and it happened, on farms that had miscalculated or faced a longer winter than expected, or lost stored hay to fire or moisture, the consequences unfolded in a grim sequence. Farmers first reduced rations, stretching the supply as far as possible. Then they supplemented with whatever else was available: straw, corn stalks, dried leaves, turnips sliced and mixed in a feed. Then, if things were truly desperate, they began making decisions about which animals to keep and which to slaughter, calculating the value of feed against the value of the animal, a cold arithmetic that no one enjoyed but everyone understood. Historians still argue about how common genuine hay shortages were versus how often families managed to avoid them through careful planning. But the frequency with which diaries and letters from this period mention the hay supply suggests it was never far from a farmer's mind. Horses required their own careful management. A working horse needed significantly more calories in winter than in summer, counterintuitively, because maintaining body temperature in cold conditions required energy, even for an animal that was doing less physical work than during the plowing season. Oats were the standard horse feed, supplemented with hay, and a horse that was being worked, hauling wood, breaking trail through snow, pulling a sledge loaded with supplies, needed more still. Getting this balance right was a matter of experience and close observation. A horse that lost too much weight over winter would be weakened come spring plowing, and plowing behind a weakened horse was its own particular misery. Pigs were, in many ways, the most practical of the winter animals and also the most opportunistic. They would eat almost anything: kitchen scraps, spoiled vegetables, grain byproducts, things that other animals wouldn't touch. And this adaptability made them relatively economical to keep through the cold months. Many families slaughtered their pigs in late autumn, just before the hardest cold set in, timing the killing to coincide with temperatures cold enough to preserve the meat naturally during the processing and curing period. A freshly slaughtered pig in November was the beginning of a winter's worth of salt pork, bacon, lard, and sausage, and the timing of the slaughter was one of the most carefully managed events of the farming calendar. Chickens required less feed than larger animals, but more attention to temperature. A chicken whose water froze would stop laying eggs. A chicken that got too cold would huddle, stop moving, and become vulnerable to the kind of damp cold that led to respiratory illness spreading through the flock with quiet efficiency. Farmers checked on their chickens with a regularity that sometimes surprised people unfamiliar with how important those eggs were, not just as food, but as one of the few things a farm wife could sell or trade for cash money in the depths of winter. The animals asked nothing of the season. They simply needed what they needed every day without pause. And every day, before breakfast, you gave it to them. You have to duck a little to get inside. The door is low and heavy, built from thick planks that have swollen slightly with autumn moisture and require a firm pull to open. There's a particular sound it makes, a soft, reluctant groan, that you have heard so many times it has become part of the rhythm of the day, as familiar as the creak of the barn door or the particular note the kettle makes just before it boils. You pull it open, and the smell comes up to meet you before your eyes have adjusted to the darkness. It is a good smell, earthy, dense, a little sweet from the apple stored in the far corner, a little sharp from the crocks of fermenting cabbage along the wall, underlaid with the clean, mineral scent of bare earth that never quite goes away no matter how long the cellar has been in use. It is the smell of survival, though you would never think of it in those terms. It is simply the smell of the cellar. You step down. The root cellar was, without question, one of the most important structures on a 19th century American farm. Not the most glamorous. No one was writing poetry about root cellars, or at least not much, but important in the way that lungs are important. Quietly, continuously, without drama, it kept the family alive through the months when nothing grew and the ground was iron hard and the nearest store, if there was one, might be a day's journey away through snow. The principle behind it was elegant in its simplicity. Dig down far enough into the earth, and the temperature stabilizes. Not warm. Exactly. Typically somewhere between 32 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit year-round in most of the American Northeast and Midwest, but crucially, consistently cold without freezing. This was the narrow band of temperature that preserved most vegetables and many preserved foods for months at a time. Too warm, and things would rot or sprout prematurely. Too cold, and they would freeze, which for most root vegetables meant a mushy, ruined texture upon thawing. The cellar's job was to stay in that narrow band, and a well-built cellar, positioned correctly and ventilated thoughtfully, did exactly that through the worst of winter with no input from you beyond the occasional adjustment of a ventilation slot. Building a good root cellar was a skill passed down carefully. The ideal location was dug into a north-facing hillside, which minimized sun exposure and helped keep temperatures low and stable. The walls were often lined with stone, which moderated temperature fluctuations, absorbing cold at night and releasing it slowly through the day. The floor was typically left as bare earth, which allowed moisture to regulate naturally. A cellar that was too dry would cause root vegetables to shrivel and lose their texture, while one that was too damp would encourage rot and mold. Getting this balance right was an ongoing project, not a one-time achievement. Farmers added dry straw to absorb excess moisture. They opened ventilation gaps on mild days to refresh the air. They packed their most vulnerable stores, potatoes especially, in layers of dry sand or sawdust to insulate them from temperature swings. The contents of a well-stocked root cellar in early winter read like an inventory of everything standing between the family and a very unpleasant spring. Potatoes occupied the largest space, typically. A family might store several hundred pounds of them, sorted by size. The smaller ones set aside to be used first since they stored less well than the larger varieties. Turnips and parsnips filled wooden bins along one wall. Carrots were packed in damp sand to keep them crisp. Beets, which stored exceptionally well and provided a reliable source of sweetness in a winter diet that was otherwise fairly austere, were piled in their own corner. Cabbages hung from the ceiling beams on hooks or were packed in barrels with salt, slowly becoming the sauerkraut that would be a staple of winter meals for months. Apples deserved their own careful management. A good storing apple variety, and 19th century American farmers grew dozens of varieties specifically selected for their keeping qualities. Varieties with names like Roxbury Russet and Newton Pippin and Golden Russet that have largely vanished from modern markets could last in cool cellar conditions from October all the way through to April. They provided sweetness, variety, and vitamin C at a time when fresh fruit was otherwise entirely absent from the diet. Historians have noted that the diversity of apple varieties grown in this period was staggering. Estimates suggest that 19th century America had access to over 1,000 distinct apple varieties, compared to the handful that dominate modern grocery stores. Most of those varieties were optimized not for appearance or uniform size, but for flavor, storage, and usefulness in cooking, and their disappearance from the modern food system represents a genuine, if quiet, agricultural loss. Alongside the vegetables sat the preserved foods. Crocks of salted butter, sealed with a layer of brine to keep air out. Jars of lard, pale and solid in the cold. Strings of dried herbs hanging from nails in the beams above. Jars of preserved fruits, cherries, plums, berries, put up in late summer and now waiting patiently in the dimness. Smoked hams hung from hooks, wrapped in cloth to keep insects away, slowly losing moisture in the cool air in a way that concentrated their flavor and extended their keeping time. You moved through this space carefully, taking what was needed for today, mentally noting the levels, calculating the ratios, doing the quiet arithmetic of winter survival that never quite left the back of your mind. The cellar asked very little of you. It simply asked that you had filled it well in autumn. And tonight, pulling the heavy door closed behind you with its familiar groan, carrying your basket of potatoes and a crock of butter back up toward the warm light of the kitchen, you felt something that was not quite happiness, but was very close to its practical equivalent. You had enough. For today, you had enough. There's a saying, old enough that no one can quite agree on who said it first, that goes something like this: firewood warms you twice. Once when you chop it, and once when you burn it. It is the kind of saying that sounds pleasantly wise until you have actually spent a full morning splitting wood in November, at which point it starts to feel less like wisdom and more like something a person said to make themselves feel better about a very cold and very tiring situation. But there is truth in it, undeniable, practical truth. On a 19th century American farm, firewood was not a convenience. It was not something you thought about casually, the way we might think about replacing a battery or refilling a propane tank. Firewood was the difference between a functioning household and a catastrophically non-functioning one. It was the fuel that cooked every meal, heated every room, warmed every wash basin of water, dried every set of damp work clothes, and kept the family from experiencing winter in the most direct and unpleasant way possible. Without it, nothing else on the farm worked correctly. Without enough of it, the winter became a different kind of problem entirely. So farmers thought about firewood the way serious people think about serious things. The woodpile was not just a practical resource. It was a signal. A tall, well-organized, properly stacked woodpile visible from the road communicated something important about the family who lived there. That they were prepared, that they were competent, that they had their affairs in order. A thin or poorly arranged woodpile communicated the opposite. In communities where reputation and self-sufficiency were deeply intertwined, the state of your woodpile was not entirely a private matter. Cutting and preparing firewood for winter was a months-long process that typically began in late spring or early summer, for reasons that take a moment to appreciate. Freshly cut wood, green wood, as it is called, contains a tremendous amount of moisture. Burning green wood is an exercise in frustration. It burns inefficiently, produces far more smoke than heat and deposits creosote in the chimney at a rate that significantly increases the risk of a chimney fire. To burn well, wood needed to dry, and drying wood properly, in most climates, took the better part of a year, which meant that the wood you were burning in January of a given year had ideally been cut and split the previous spring, stacked in a way that allowed air to circulate through the pile, protected from direct rain by a simple roof of bark or boards, and left to season slowly through the summer and autumn. This meant that at any given point in the farming year, a well-managed farm was working on 2 firewood supplies simultaneously, burning last year's seasoned wood while cutting and stacking next year's. The species of wood mattered considerably. Different trees produced wood with very different burning qualities, and farmers learned these distinctions early and kept them in mind when selecting which trees to fell. Oak was prized above almost everything else. Dense, slow-burning, long-lasting, it produced a deep sustained heat that was ideal for overnight fires and the long, slow burning needed to maintain a kitchen fireplace through a full day of cooking. Hickory burned similarly hot and was particularly valued in areas where it grew abundantly. Maple burned cleanly and split with satisfying predictability. Elm, on the other hand, was notoriously difficult to split. Its interlocking grain resisted the axe in a way that was widely regarded as a personal insult. And ash, though easier to split, burned faster and required more frequent loading of the fireplace. Pine and other softwoods burned brightly but quickly, producing a lot of flame and not much sustained heat, and depositing creosote in chimneys at a rate that made them useful for starting fires but problematic as a primary fuel. Historians still debate the extent to which 19th century American farmers systematically managed their woodlots as a renewable resource versus simply cutting what was available and closest to hand. The evidence suggests considerable regional variation. In densely settled areas of New England, where good timber was already becoming scarce by the early 1800s, woodlot management was a genuine concern and the subject of advice in farming publications. In the heavily forested regions of the expanding Midwest, the situation was very different. Trees were often seen as obstacles to cultivation rather than resources to be conserved, and the clearing of forested land was an economic activity in itself. Splitting the wood was its own particular art. A good splitter developed an intuition for the grain of the wood, where to place the axe, how much force to apply, how to read the subtle cues in the end grain that told you whether this piece would split cleanly in one stroke or require coaxing. A well-placed stroke on a dry piece of oak produced a deeply satisfying crack and 2 clean halves. A poorly placed stroke on a knotted piece of elm produced a thud, a vibration that traveled uncomfortably up both arms, and no progress whatsoever. Children learned to split wood early, starting with smaller pieces and working up to the full rounds as their strength and judgment developed. The wood was stacked with care, not carelessly piled, but genuinely stacked. Each piece placed to allow air circulation, the pile oriented to take advantage of prevailing winds, the ends protected where the wood was most vulnerable to moisture absorption. A collapsed wood pile in the middle of January was not merely an annoyance. It was a cold, time-consuming problem that nobody wanted. And on the coldest nights of winter, when the fire burned low in the small hours, and you rose half asleep to feed it another log, reaching into the box beside the hearth for a piece of dry, seasoned oak that caught and held almost immediately, spreading its warmth back into the room with quiet reliability. In that moment, you understood exactly what the woodpile was. It was every early morning in May you'd spent with the axe. It was every afternoon of stacking in July. It was foresight made physical, effort made warm. It was enough. Let's talk about salt pork. Not because it is the most exciting subject in the world. It is not. And it was not. And the people eating it knew it. But because if you want to understand what a 19th century American farm family actually put in their mouths between November and April, salt pork is where you have to start. It was everywhere. It was in the bean pot. It was in the soup. It was in the pan with the potatoes. It was the fat used to fry the cornbread. It was the background flavor of nearly every savory thing that came out of a farmhouse kitchen in winter, as constant and unremarkable as the sound of the wind outside. Salt pork was simply pork, typically the fattier cuts, the belly and the sides, that had been packed in salt to preserve it. The process was straightforward and ancient. You layered the meat with coarse salt in a barrel or crock, allowed the salt to draw out moisture and create a brine, and then left it. In cool cellar conditions, salt pork could last for months. It was not delicious in the way that a fresh pork chop in June is delicious. It was intensely salty, requiring soaking in water before cooking to make it palatable, and even after soaking it retained a density and saltiness that modern taste buds would find challenging. But it was protein. It was fat. It was calories in a season when calories were not something you wasted cinnamon on. Alongside the salt pork sat the beans. Dried beans were one of the great staples of the 19th century American winter diet, and with good reason. They stored almost indefinitely in dry conditions. They were nutritionally substantial, providing both protein and complex carbohydrates, and they could be cooked slowly over a low fire for hours, which was convenient in a kitchen where the fireplace or wood stove was burning constantly anyway, and something might as well be hanging over it. A pot of beans with a piece of salt pork dropped in for flavor could simmer gently all morning while you were out doing the barn chores, and it would be ready by midday without requiring your constant attention. This was not a small virtue in a household where attention was always in short supply. Cornbread appeared on the table with a frequency that modern people would find remarkable. Cornmeal was ground from dried corn and stored in quantities that seem almost theatrical by today's standards. It was the carbohydrate foundation of the winter diet in much of rural America, particularly in the Midwest and South, baked into dense, slightly gritty loaves in a cast iron pan, set over the fire or in a Dutch oven buried in coals. It was not the sweet, cakey cornbread of modern Southern restaurants. It was denser, less sweet, more aggressively corny, and it filled you up in the thorough, unambiguous way that a day of outdoor labor in freezing temperatures required. Potatoes appeared at nearly every meal. Boiled, roasted in the ashes of the fireplace, fried in lard, mashed with whatever fat was available. Potatoes were the great anchor of the winter plate, reliable and filling and mercifully variable in their preparation. A family with a well-stocked root cellar might eat potatoes in some form twice a day from November to April and consider themselves fortunate, which they were. Potatoes provided calories, some vitamin C, and a satisfying bulk that more delicate foods could not offer. They were not exciting. No one in a 19th century farm diary writes about potatoes with enthusiasm. But absence of enthusiasm is not the same as absence of gratitude. The winter diet had its moments of genuine pleasure. Apple butter, slowly cooked down from autumn apples with cider and spices over hours of stirring, was spread on cornbread and biscuits and eaten with the uncomplicated pleasure of something sweet in a diet that was otherwise fairly austere. Maple syrup, in regions where maple trees grew and the late winter sugaring season was approaching, was a genuine luxury and a seasonal marker. Its arrival on the table meant that winter was loosening its grip. Dried fruits, apple slices, dried cherries, occasionally dried plums, added sweetness and variety when they were available and were saved for special occasions or for the children. Milk and its products played an important role. A dairy cow that was still producing through winter provided the household with fresh milk, butter, and soft cheese that added fat and richness to an otherwise lean diet. Not all cows produced reliably through winter. Production dropped significantly in cold conditions with reduced feed, but a good dairy cow, well managed and adequately fed, was worth considerably more than her weight in almost any other farm asset during the cold months. Farmers who kept good dairy records, and some did, with a thoroughness that historians have found genuinely useful, tracked daily milk production the way a modern business owner tracks revenue. Historians still argue about the overall nutritional adequacy of the 19th century American farm winter diet. The consensus seems to be that it was calorie sufficient for most families in most years. The combination of fat, starch, and protein from salt pork, beans, cornmeal, and potatoes provided enough energy for the work required. What it lacked in most cases was variety, fresh vegetables, and a range of vitamins that the preserved and dried foods could not fully provide. Scurvy was not common among farm families in the way it was among sailors or isolated frontier settlers, partly because sauerkraut, root vegetables, and stored apples provided enough vitamin C to prevent it, but borderline nutritional deficiencies were probably more common than the historical record can clearly show. The meals were simple. They were repetitive. They were made with care from ingredients that had been grown, harvested, preserved, and stored by the same hands that now prepared them. There was something in that continuity, something that connected the August afternoon of putting up the beans to the January evening of eating them, that no restaurant meal, however excellent, quite replicates. You ate what you had grown, and you had grown it knowing you would need it. There is a particular kind of cold that arrives somewhere around the middle of January. It is not the brisk, almost enjoyable cold of early December, the kind that makes the air smell clean and puts a pleasant flush in your cheeks and makes you feel, briefly, like being outdoors is a reasonable life choice. This is a different cold entirely. It is the cold that has settled in, that has made itself at home, that has been present so long it no longer feels like a weather event and starts to feel like a permanent condition of the universe. The sky is the same flat, white it has been for 3 weeks. The snow that fell in late December has not melted, but has instead compressed into a firm, grayish crust that squeaks unpleasantly underfoot. The temperature has not been above freezing in so long that the idea of above freezing has started to feel slightly theoretical. And yet, the barn door needs opening. The animals need feeding. The water needs hauling. The fire needs tending. The ice on the stock tank needs breaking. The manure in the stalls needs mucking out. The chickens need checking. The milk needs collecting. The wood box beside the kitchen door needs refilling. And all of this needs doing before the morning is very old. Regardless of what the thermometer says, regardless of how the sky looks, regardless of how your body feels about leaving the warmth of the bed. This was the reality of winter farm life in 1800s America that is perhaps hardest for the modern imagination to fully absorb. We tend to think of winter, even intellectually, as a slower season. A season of rest and repair and quiet indoor activities. And while there were elements of that on the 19th century farm, and we will get to them, the daily chore load did not meaningfully decrease with the arrival of cold weather. In some ways it increased, because cold weather created problems that warm weather did not. Water was perhaps the most relentless of the winter problems. Animals needed water every day in quantities that were not small. A dairy cow required something in the range of 30 to 50 gallons of water per day to maintain production, a number that sits there calmly until you try to imagine hauling it by hand from a well or a creek in January. The water in the stock tank froze overnight, and every morning before the animals could drink, someone had to break the ice. This was done with a heavy iron bar or a specialized ice-breaking tool, swung repeatedly at the frozen surface until it gave way, a task that was exactly as cold and exactly as tedious as it sounds. Wells froze. Pumps froze. The leather valves inside hand pumps became stiff and uncooperative in extreme cold and required warming, sometimes literally pouring warm water over them before they would function. Some farms solved the water problem partially by locating their wells or water sources inside or directly adjacent to the barn, where the animal's body heat kept temperatures marginally above freezing. Others relied on springs that ran year-round without freezing. But for many families, particularly those in the colder regions of the Northeast and Upper Midwest, hauling and managing water in winter was a significant daily labor that has been somewhat underrepresented in the romantic accounts of farm life. Mucking out the barn was another task that waited for no one. Animals confined to a barn through a long winter produced manure in quantities that required regular removal to prevent the buildup of ammonia gases that could damage the animals' respiratory systems and reduce their productivity. This was done with a pitchfork and a wheelbarrow or sledge. The accumulated bedding and waste carried out to a manure pile that grew steadily through the winter and would be spread on the fields come spring as fertilizer. It was cold work, and it was unpleasant work, and it was necessary work, and it was done every day or every other day, depending on the number of animals and the size of the barn, and no one thought it was particularly remarkable because it simply was what it was. Keeping the house fires burning was its own continuous demand. A farmhouse in the 1800s typically heated with one or more fireplaces, and later in the century with wood-burning stoves, which were considerably more efficient but still required constant feeding. A fire left unattended for too long in truly cold weather could drop the coals, and bringing a cold house back to a comfortable temperature from near frozen was a slow and frustrating process. Many families kept their kitchen fire going around the clock through the deepest winter months, someone rising in the night to feed it, the schedule of fire tending woven into the household routine as naturally as sleeping and eating. The chamber pots needed emptying. The ash from the fireplaces needed removing. It was saved carefully because wood ash had uses in soap making and in the garden, and throwing it away would have seemed wasteful to a degree bordering on the irresponsible. The candles or oil lamps needed trimming and refilling. The children needed tending. Historians still debate the precise daily schedules of 19th century farm households, noting that the available evidence, diaries, letters, farm account books, tend to underrepresent the routine labor performed by women in particular, whose contributions to the daily functioning of the household were so constant and so expected that they were often simply not recorded, in the same way that breathing is not recorded. The day ended when the work was done, which was usually after dark. You came inside. You shed the outer layers, the heavy coat, the wool scarves, the mittens that had gotten damp despite everything. And you felt the warmth of the kitchen like a physical thing, like something you could lean against. The fire was burning. Something was on the stove. Tomorrow the water would freeze again. But that was tomorrow. Somewhere around the second week of January, after the rhythm of the winter chores had settled into its daily groove, after the cellar inventory had been checked and rechecked, and the hay supply had been assessed with the practiced eye of someone who has done this calculation before and knows exactly how much anxiety it is permitted to generate. Somewhere in that particular stretch of deep winter, a farmer in the 1800s would turn his attention inward. Not inward in a philosophical sense, though the long, quiet evenings certainly encouraged a certain amount of reflection. Inward in a practical sense, toward the barn, the workshop, the kitchen tables spread with tools and leather and wire, toward the accumulated small failures of the previous year, the harness that had been cracking since August and held together through harvest by a combination of hope and baling twine, the plow blade that had struck a rock in October and developed a chip along its edge that hadn't been quite right since, the axe handle that was slightly loose in a way that was merely annoying in summer, but would become genuinely dangerous come spring woodcutting season. Winter was repair season. This is one of those aspects of 19th century farm life that tend to get overlooked in favor of more dramatic material. The blizzards, the food shortages, the heroic harvests. But the patient, methodical work of maintaining equipment through the winter months was as essential to the farm's survival as anything that happened in the fields. A farm that emerged from winter with broken tools, worn harnesses, and neglected infrastructure was a farm that entered the frantic spring planting season already behind, already scrambling, already fighting uphill against problems that a few winter afternoons of careful work could have prevented. The harness was typically the most time-consuming of the repair projects. A working farm in the 1800s depended on leather harness in quantities that are difficult to fully appreciate from a modern vantage point. Every horse needed a collar, a bridle, traces, and an assortment of straps and buckles and connections that linked the animal to whatever implement was being pulled. All of this was leather, and leather under the stress of daily agricultural work cracked, stretched, wore thin at stress points, lost stitching, and developed the kind of slow structural fatigue that could cause a harness to fail at the worst possible moment. Midway through a field, with a plow buried in spring soil and a horse pulling hard against a collar that had finally given way at the shoulder. Farmers who could afford it bought new harness sections from the local saddler or general store. Many could not, or prefer not to, and so they repaired. The tools were simple: a harness needle, heavy waxed linen thread, a leather punch, a sharp knife, and a supply of neat's foot oil or tallow for conditioning the leather. The technique was learnable, and most farm men and many farm women knew it well enough to perform routine repairs, stitching cracked sections, replacing worn buckles, reinforcing stress points with additional layers of leather cut from salvage pieces. The tools of the farm required their own careful attention. Plow blades and cultivator tines that had been dulled or damaged by a season of contact with rocky soil needed sharpening or replacement. This work was sometimes done at home, with a file and a grinding stone, and sometimes taken to the local blacksmith, one of the essential figures of rural 19th century American life, whose forge was typically the warmest building in the village, and whose company was welcome on a cold January morning regardless of what you had brought in for repair. Historians still debate the degree to which 19th century American farmers were genuinely self-sufficient in their tool maintenance versus relying on the network of rural craftsmen, blacksmiths, wheelwrights, coopers, saddlers, who formed the economic and social skeleton of every farming community. The evidence suggests considerable variation. Farmers in isolated frontier regions of necessity developed broader repair skills than those within easy reach of a market town. The mythology of total self-sufficiency that sometimes attaches to this period is probably somewhat overstated. Rural Americans were deeply embedded in networks of exchange and specialized skill that made complete independence neither practical nor particularly desirable. Wooden implements required their own maintenance. Wagon wheels were a particular concern. The wooden spokes and rims of a 19th century wagon wheel shrank in dry winter conditions, loosening the iron tire that was fitted around the outside. A loose tire was a wagon wheel in the early stages of falling apart, and the repair, heating the iron tire in a fire, expanding it just enough to slip it back over the wheel, and then quenching it rapidly with water to contract it tight again, was a job that required either a blacksmith's skills or a considerable amount of confident improvisation. Plow handles cracked and needed replacing. Axe handles split and were shaped from ash or hickory and fitted carefully, tested for balance, tested again. Women's repair work ran in parallel through these same winter weeks. The household's clothing required constant attention. Wool socks developed holes with a speed that suggested the wool itself had somewhere more important to be. Mittens wore thin at the palm. Shirts lost buttons. Heavy work trousers frayed at the knee and the seat in the specific ways that heavy outdoor labor produces. Mending was done by firelight in the evenings, needles moving through thick fabric with practiced efficiency, nothing wasted, nothing discarded that could be salvaged. Quilts were made and extended and repaired. Braided rugs were worked on through the long evenings. Strips of worn fabric cut from clothing too far gone to mend, woven and braided into the heavy floor coverings that insulated the farmhouse floors against the cold rising from the earth below. Nothing was wasted. Everything that had worn out had already become something else, or was in the process of becoming it. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the needles moved, the leather was stitched, the tools were sharpened, and the farm prepared itself quietly and methodically for the season that was still 2 months away, but already being worked toward. Spring was built in winter. It just didn't look like it yet. It is easy, thinking about the 19th century American farm in winter, to imagine a kind of isolation that borders on the monastic. The farmhouse surrounded by snow. The fields empty and white. The nearest neighbor a mile down a road that has not been properly cleared since the last storm dropped 8 inches on it 4 days ago. The family gathered around the fire, self-contained, turned inward by the cold and the distance and the early dark that arrives by 4:30 in the afternoon and does not lift again until nearly 7 the next morning. It sounds lonely, described that way. It sounds like something to be endured rather than lived. And sometimes it was. The historical record is honest enough about that. But the picture of total winter isolation on a 19th century American farm is significantly incomplete, and in some ways, it is almost the opposite of the truth. Winter, for all its hardships, was in many farming communities the most socially active season of the year, not in spite of the cold and the confinement, but partly because of it. When the fields demanded nothing, when the plowing and planting and cultivating and harvesting that consumed every available hour from April through November had finally, temporarily, released their grip, there was time. Time that did not exist in any other season in quite the same way. And people used it. The quilting bee was one of the central social institutions of rural American winter life, and it deserves more attention than it typically receives in popular accounts of the period. A quilting bee brought together the women of a neighborhood, sometimes 6, sometimes a dozen or more, at one farmhouse for a day of collective work on a quilt that might take the combined effort of many hands to complete in a single session. The host provided food, which was itself an occasion for the kind of cooking that daily farm life rarely had time for: pies, cakes, preserved fruit desserts, the kind of spread that acknowledged that company was coming and company deserved something better than the weekday rotation of beans and cornbread. The quilts produced at these gatherings were not merely decorative. A heavy, well-made quilt was a significant piece of household equipment. Insulation against the cold that penetrated even well-built farmhouses, a wedding gift of genuine practical value, a thing that might last a generation if it was cared for. The patterns used in 19th century American quilts carried meaning that was partly aesthetic and partly communicative, particular designs associated with particular regions or communities or occasions. Historians still debate the extent to which certain quilt patterns carried coded messages or symbolic meanings versus being primarily decorative choices, a question that has generated a surprising amount of academic enthusiasm and not yet a definitive answer. But beyond the quilts themselves, what the quilting bee provided was conversation. In a world without newspapers delivered daily, without telephones, without any of the mechanisms of instant communication that we now take so entirely for granted that their absence is difficult to imagine, the gathering of neighbors was how information moved. Who was expecting a baby? Whose cow had died? What the general store in town was charging for sugar this month? Whether the family on the far side of the ridge had made it through the early cold snap without losing their wheat stores. These were not trivial matters dressed up as gossip. They were the news of the community, and they circulated through quilting bees and barn gatherings and church visits with a thoroughness and speed that was genuinely impressive, given the physical constraints involved. The men gathered, too, in their own configurations. Barn raisings happened in winter when schedules allowed. If a neighbor needed a new barn, whether because the old one had burned or collapsed under a heavy snow load, or simply because the farm had grown beyond what the existing structure could accommodate, the community assembled to build it. A barn raising in the 19th century was a remarkable logistical achievement. A large timber frame structure going up in a single day through the coordinated effort of dozens of men who arrived with their own tools and their own knowledge of where to stand and what to do. The host family provided food in quantities that required its own days of preparation, and the event combined genuine community labor with something that looked, by the end of the day, very much like a celebration. Sleigh rides deserve mention as one of the genuine pleasures of the winter social calendar. Once the snow had packed sufficiently, travel by sleigh was in some ways easier and faster than travel by wagon on muddy autumn roads. The runners of a sleigh glided over packed snow with a smoothness that wagon wheels on dirt tracks could not approach, and the bells attached to the harness, which served the practical function of warning pedestrians and other travelers of an approaching vehicle, produced a sound so pleasant and so thoroughly associated in the cultural memory with winter joy that it has never quite left us. Young people in particular found the sleigh, right? A welcome occasion for the kind of close proximity that the rest of farm social life did not often provide. Church, where it was accessible, anchored the winter social calendar. The Sunday gathering was simultaneously a religious observance, a community meeting, a news exchange, and a social event, and the ride to church in the family sleigh was itself a ritual that many farm families described with warmth in their letters and diaries. The church was often cold. Heating a large wooden building in the 19th century was a genuine challenge, and the congregation sat in their coats and shawls and breathed visible clouds into the air, and the sermons were sometimes long, and afterward everyone stood in the cold outside, talking for considerably longer than the temperature strictly warranted, because the talking was the point. These gatherings, the bees and the raisings and the church visits and the sleigh rides, were not supplementary to the serious business of winter survival. They were part of it. A community that knew each other, that had worked and eaten and laughed together through the dark months, was a community that would show up when the next hard thing came. And on a 19th century American farm, the next hard thing was never very far away. There is a particular silence that follows a blizzard, not the ordinary quiet of a winter night, which has its own gentle quality. The muffled sound of snow falling, the distant sound of wind in the bare trees, the creak of the farmhouse settling in the cold. This is a different silence, heavier, more absolute. It is the silence of a world that has been rearranged overnight into something that no longer quite resembles what it was the day before, and it arrives on the morning after a serious storm with a weight that even the most experienced farmer felt in the chest before they had fully processed what they were looking at. The door would not open outward. The snow had drifted against it through the night, packing itself against the frame with a quiet thoroughness that turned a simple door into a serious problem. You pushed. The snow pushed back. You found the other door, the one on the lee side of the house, and that one opened, and you stepped out into a world that was white in every direction, white above and white below, and white where the barn had been and where the fence line had been and where the road had been. And for a long moment you simply stood there taking inventory of what the storm had left you. Winter on a 19th century American farm was not always the quiet, manageable hardship of cold mornings and monotonous meals and chores that never stopped. Sometimes it was something considerably more serious than that. Sometimes it crossed a line from hardship into genuine danger, and when it did so with a speed and completeness that left very little room for the kind of careful response that most farm problems allowed. Blizzards are the most dramatic of winter's weapons, but not necessarily the most deadly in their immediate impact. The greater danger of a severe blizzard was what it left behind. Livestock that had been caught outside when the storm came in, and storms on the open prairies of the Midwest in particular could arrive with a speed that caught even experienced farmers off guard, could be lost entirely. Cattle that became disoriented in whiteout conditions wandered away from shelter and were found days later, frozen in a field a quarter-mile from the barn they could not locate through the blinding snow. This was not a rare occurrence on the frontier farms of Illinois, Iowa, and the territories further west. It was a recognized hazard, one that experienced farmers took seriously enough to string guide ropes between the farmhouse and the barn before a storm, so that the morning chores could be done without the risk of becoming lost in the 20 yards between the two buildings. The blizzard of 1888, known as the school children's blizzard in January and the Great White Hurricane in March, has been well documented by historians as among the most catastrophic weather events in 19th century American agricultural history. The January storm in particular struck the northern plains with almost no warning, catching children in schoolhouses and farmers in their fields in temperatures that plummeted so rapidly that survival became a matter of minutes rather than hours. Hundreds of people died across the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Minnesota in a single afternoon and night, many of them found frozen within sight of buildings they had been unable to locate in the blinding snow and wind. But deadly winters did not require a single catastrophic storm. The slow grind of an unusually long or cold winter was in many ways a more insidious threat, because it worked gradually, eroding resources and strength and morale in increments small enough that the danger crept up without announcing itself. A family that entered winter with what seemed like adequate food stores might find themselves in serious difficulty by late February if the cold had lasted longer than expected, if illness had prevented the normal pace of chores and management, if the hay supply had run lower than projected, and the animals were losing condition faster than anticipated. Frostbite was a constant companion of outdoor winter work. The extremities, fingers, toes, ears, the tip of the nose, were vulnerable in ways that farmers managed through layers of wool and constant attention to how their hands and feet felt. Because the early stages of frostbite produce a numbness that can be mistaken for simple cold, and the transition from uncomfortable to genuinely damaged tissue happened faster than most people expected the first time they experienced it. Farm workers who spent long hours breaking ice, hauling wood, or searching for lost livestock in extreme cold frequently suffered frostbite injuries that range from superficial and temporary to permanently damaging. Illness moved through farm families in winter with particular efficiency. The confinement of winter, the same small group of people sharing a small heated space for months, often sleeping in close proximity to conserve warmth, created ideal conditions for the transmission of respiratory illness. A fever that struck the primary adult worker of a household was not merely a personal misfortune. It was a logistical crisis because the chores did not pause for illness. The animals still needed water. The fire still needed feeding. The ice still needed breaking. Children stepped into these roles as best they could, and farm wives who were already carrying a full load of household labor added the outdoor chores of an incapacitated husband without ceremony or complaint because there was no alternative. Historians still debate the mortality patterns of rural American winters in the 19th century, noting that record-keeping was inconsistent and that deaths from cold-related causes were not always accurately recorded as such. What the diaries and letters of the period make plain, in language that is often matter-of-fact to the point of being startling to modern readers, is that death was not an abstract presence in these communities. It arrived in winter with a regularity that people acknowledged, prepared for as best they could, and absorbed into the ongoing rhythm of farm life with a stoicism that was not indifference, but its own particular form of courage. The farm went on. It always went on, because there was no alternative to going on, and the people who lived these lives understood that as clearly as they understood anything. Somewhere in the middle of February, something changes. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself with fanfare or arrive with any of the obvious, unmistakable signals that autumn sends when it is coming. The turning leaves, the sharpening air, the sudden urgency in the behavior of the animals. The change that comes in mid-February is quieter than any of that. It is the kind of change you notice almost by accident, the way you notice that the light in a room has shifted without being able to say exactly when it shifted or what moved. The days are getting longer. Not by much. Not yet. A few minutes more of pale winter light at the end of the afternoon. The sunset pushed back just far enough that you notice the sky is not yet fully dark when you finish the evening barn chores, and you stand for a moment in the farmyard with the empty bucket in your hand, and look at that thin remaining brightness on the western horizon, and feel something that is difficult to name precisely, but is somewhere in the neighborhood of hope. On a 19th century American farm, the return of light was not a poetic abstraction. It was a practical event with practical consequences, and experienced farmers tracked it with the same careful attention they gave to the hay supply and the root cellar inventory. More light meant warmer days approaching. Warmer days meant the ground would eventually soften. The ground softening meant plowing. Plowing meant planting. Planting meant the whole vast machinery of the farming year spinning back into motion, and everything that the winter had demanded. The early mornings and the frozen water and the monotonous meals and the endless chores and the long dark evenings would be redeemed or at least contextualized by the renewal that was coming. But February was not spring. February had to be lived through first. In February on a 19th century American farm had a particular quality that many farm diaries describe with a weariness that is different from the weariness of December or January. By February, the novelty of winter, if it had ever had any, was entirely gone. The woodpile was visibly smaller than it had been. The root cellar shelves were noticeably less full. The hay in the barn loft had dropped to a level that required daily recalculation of the remaining supply against the remaining weeks of cold. The animals were restless in the way that confined animals become after months of confinement. Not sick, not injured, simply done with the barn in a way that expressed itself in small irritabilities and reduced productivity. And the family was tired. Not the sharp, satisfying tiredness of a hard day's work in good weather, but the accumulated gray tiredness of months of unrelenting cold and unrelenting labor and unrelenting sameness. Farm diaries from this period, read carefully, show a subtle but consistent pattern. Entries become shorter in February, less descriptive, more clipped. The careful observations of October and November, the detailed accounts of harvest quantities and weather patterns in animal behavior, give way by February to entries that sometimes read as little more than a list. Fed cattle, broke ice, brought wood, mildy cold. The writer has not lost interest in their life. They are simply very, very tired. And yet the signs came, one by one, and each one mattered. The maple trees were first in the regions where maple sugaring was practiced. Sometime in late February or early March, when the days climbed just above freezing while the nights still dropped well below, the sap began to move in the sugar maples. This was not visible from the outside, but experienced farmers knew the conditions that produced it, the specific combination of freezing nights and thawing days that created the pressure differential inside the tree that pushed the sap upward and outward, tapping the maples, hanging the buckets, collecting the sap, and boiling it down in the sugar house into syrup and sugar. This was hard, steam-filled, sweet-smelling work, and it was among the most welcome work of the entire year because it meant that winter was breaking. The mud came next, and it was welcomed even though it was deeply inconvenient. Mud season, the period between the frozen ground of winter and the firm ground of late spring, was a genuine logistical challenge for 19th century farm families. Roads that had been passable by sleigh became impassable by wagon as the frost left the ground and the surface turned to a deep, clinging mud that could swallow a wheel to the axle and defeat a horse in a matter of yards. Farm lanes became treacherous. The farmyard became a study in strategic footpath planning. But underneath the inconvenience, the mud meant something beautiful and fundamental. The earth was alive again. The ground that had been sealed and frozen and inaccessible for months was opening, breathing, preparing to receive seed. The first birdsong of returning species was tracked and noted in farm diaries with a consistency that suggests it was genuinely important to people. The red-winged blackbird was often the first to return to the Midwest and Northeast, its liquid, slightly rusty call drifting across fields that still had patches of snow in the low places, and the sound of it in a farm diary from this period is almost always followed by a sentence that expresses, in whatever words the writer had available, that the hearing of it was a significant moment. Not merely pleasant, significant, the way a landmark is significant on a long journey. Not because it means you have arrived, but because it tells you that you are closer than you were. Historians have noted that the emotional texture of farm life in this period, as revealed in diaries and letters, shows a recurring pattern of deep midwinter flatness followed by a gradual, tentative brightening that tracked almost exactly with the returning light and the first biological signs of spring. This was not seasonal affective disorder in the clinical sense, though some of what is described in these documents would likely meet modern diagnostic criteria. It was something more universal, the human response to darkness and confinement and cold, and the equally human response to their lifting. And so the farmer began, quietly, to prepare. Seeds that had been stored through the winter in dry paper packets and carefully labeled crocks were brought out and inspected. The plow was examined, the blade assessed, the wooden beam checked for cracks that might have developed in the dry winter air. The harness, repaired through those long January evenings, was oiled again and fitted to the horse that had been standing in the barn since November, and the horse, feeling the harness settle across its back, shifted its weight and lifted its head in a way that suggested it understood something had changed. The garden beds near the farmhouse were uncovered from their mulch of straw. The soil beneath was dark and dense and cold, but no longer frozen, and pressing a hand into it, you could feel its potential. The way you can sometimes feel a room full of people about to laugh before the laughter actually comes. You stood up. You looked at the sky. It was still gray, still pale, still more winter than spring. But it was different gray, a warmer gray, a gray that was thinking about becoming something else. And you went inside, and you ate your dinner of salt pork and potatoes and the last of the dried apple preserves, and you felt something you had not quite felt since October, a forward-leaning feeling, a sense of what was coming rather than what had been endured. Tomorrow you would check the seeds again. Tomorrow you would count the remaining weeks. Tomorrow you would begin, in small and practical ways, the long process of becoming a summer farm again. Tonight, you rested. Tonight, you let the fire burn low and the house settle around you, and the darkness outside do what darkness does, and you slept the sleep of someone who has come through something difficult and knows that the difficult thing is nearly over. The snow was still on the ground. The nights were still cold. The root cellar still had weeks of work left in it, and the barn still needed its morning rounds, and the wood pile still needed to last until the weather made it unnecessary. But the light was coming back. It always came back, and that was enough, more than enough, to carry you through whatever days remained between where you were and where you were going. Sleep now. You have earned it. The fields will be there in the morning, waiting patiently the way fields do, the way they always have, the way they always will, quietly and without any hurry at all. Sweet dreams.